Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. Welcome to Mastering On1 Photo RAW 2018. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the most underrated module in On1 Photo RAW 2018. That is the Resize Module. Now, if you're new to post-processing and printing, you may be wondering why we even need a Resize module. And to tell you the truth, in most instances, we don't. And the reason why we don't is because our cameras today shoot with super high resolution. For example, this image was shot with a Nikon D800E, and if we look over at the Info tab, you could see that the dimensions of this image are 7,360 pixels by 4,912 pixels. Now, if I want to print this, I could look at a recommended resolution chart for various size prints to see if this would produce a decent print. And you could see that it's off the charts. At 10 by 20, they're recommending a 2,500 pixel by 5,000 pixel image for an optimal print. I'm way above that. So I could print a very large image with this straight out of camera. Now, where you get in trouble is when you have maybe a camera that isn't that high resolution and you want to create a very large print, or if you crop. As this image, as you could see, it's not a great image. I think I focused on a spot and the blue jay came in from the right and I just snapped a picture. And you could see that it's off center. It's not very dynamic. It's cut the blue jay off. It's not a great picture. But if I crop it and I just have the blue jay's head, it would be an excellent picture. But when I crop, I'm cropping away pixels. And when you're cropping away pixels, you're cropping away resolution. So, for example, if I get the crop tool and I just go up here and I want the original ratio and I just start cropping away, and I'll get it pretty small. I just want the blue jay's head. And I'm going to click Apply. Then I'll open the crop tool again, and let's look at the ratio that I cropped to. I cropped to 3,628 pixels by 2,421 pixels. Now, if I look at my recommended resolution chart, it looks like I could probably print a 10 by 13, nothing bigger than that. And even that is pushing it a little bit. What if I want to print a 20 by 30? Well, that's where the Resize module comes in. And as far as the Resize module is concerned, it may be a little difficult to grasp. That's what we're going to go over now. And also, it can disappoint if you really don't know what you're doing. So I'm going to reset this crop. So we're back to our normal image. And I'm currently in the develop module, and I did do some minor processing to the image. There's before and there's after. I just did some tone and color processing, and I added some sharpening and noise reduction. And On1's lens database does not have my Nikon 200 to 500 millimeter lens in it, so there is no profile done for that, but that's no big deal. Let's send it over to Resize. So I'll click on the Resize button here over on the right hand side. And what it will do when you send an image into Resize, it does not modify, or you will not be working on the original RAW file. It will create a PSD file. So when we're done and we go back, let's say, into the Browse module, we're going to have two versions of this image. We're going to have the Resize PSD file and our original RAW file. Now, when we're opened up into Resize, it's going to apply some of the settings you previously used, particularly sharpening, and you can see how it sharpened it quite a bit. Now, there's a couple different ways you could go here. You could start right over on the right-hand panel and just kind of dial in the size you need. Let's say you're looking at a chart and you want to print a 20 by 30, and your print lab says if you're printing a 20 by 30, you need a resolution of this, and they're going to tell you size of this and resolution of this. And you could dial that in. But I think what would be easier and more straightforward is to start with one of the presets. The presets are on the left side, and there's a number of different presets for different types of paper, the more common papers, Canon, Epson, and HP. So if you're printing it on your own and you're using one of these 9 different papers, I think there's 9 of them, you could just pick that paper and then it's going to set the settings as you need for that specific paper. Now for this demonstration, let's just suppose that I'm going to send it off to a photo lab, and there is a photo lab choice. There's also a choice if you're going to use it in a video or if you're just going to use it online and share it in the internet. There's a web and email option as well. But we're going to use the photo lab, and I mentioned I want a really big print, so we're going to go 20 by 30. And as soon as I click on that, it will bring up the crop tool, so I could automatically start cropping. And I mentioned that I want to just get the Blue Jay's head in there. Something like that. So really tight on the Blue Jay's head, we're going to click Apply. Now again, you could do any of these settings up here with the typical crop settings that we covered in previous videos. No need to do that here. We just zeroed in on Mr. Blue Jay's head. We'll click Apply. Now once we've done that, if we look over at the right hand panel, you could see in the pixel dimensions, to print a 20 by 30, we need 9,000 pixels width by 6,002 pixels height. That's considerably bigger than our original image. And you could see that it's going to create a file that is 309.07 megabytes. And it's a 16-bit file, so it's upscaling the image 231%. On1 claims you could upscale up to 1,000%. I don't necessarily agree with that. The best results I've found is when you keep your upscaling at 300% or lower. I found that if I've tried to upscale some image like 400%, and they get artifacts in them and pixelation in it. Now you might be wondering, why don't we just use the print module in Lightroom or use Photoshop to upscale? Even with that pixelation that I mentioned you'd find, or I found, when I'm upscaling over 300%, Photoshop and Lightroom are worse. They don't do as good a job. On1 uses, with On1 Resize, what they call genuine fractals technology. It's a patented technology. And it really is kind of the standard in the industry. Those art directors and people that need to take images and upscale them for billboards and sides of buses and inside of trains and things like that, they use On1 to do it because it really is the best at doing upscaling. So we have this huge image we're going to be creating. Below that is the document size. It's a 20 by 30 and a resolution of 300. Now, if you're printing, you should print at a resolution of at least 300, no less than 240. But 300 is usually recommended. And if you click on this little drop down, you can see that it has some presets. And you can see one of the resolutions for Epson small format printers is 360 pixels per inch. So if you are printing this on your own, definitely use that 360 option. But for this case, in the printer I usually use, the lab I use is Bay Photo Lab. I have no affiliation with them and they don't pay me for mentioning their name. But they want images that have a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. So that's what we'll keep there. So we have this 30 by 20. Now, the actual settings, what algorithm is On1 going to use to upscale this image? It's going to default to their patented algorithm of general fractals. Usually that will work great. And if we look at the image type in that little drop down, you can see that there's a number of different image presets in here. One is low resolution JPEG, which I'm not really sure why they have that in there, because if you're going to print to a low resolution JPEG, you really don't need to resize it. Just send it off to your printer and print it. Portrait does not use the genuine fractals technology because the genuine fractals technology does not work great with skin. So when you use the portrait preset, it's going to use a different algorithm that's called bicubic. So it's going to use the bicubic algorithm for a portrait. Generally, that's what you should use. Now, for landscape and high detail, as was general purpose, it will use this general fractals technology, which works great. Now, if the preset is usually what I use, but if you really want to come in and move the sliders and understand what they'll do, I'll do my best to try to explain it. It's difficult because the slider they have labeled as texture, it really does not affect texture or add any texture to the image. There really isn't a word that properly describes what that slider does. For lack of a better term, I guess if you go in and you look at the smallest detail in your image, as you move that texture slider to the right, it's going to try to sharpen or make sure that that smallest detail remains constant as it's upscaled. The problem is if you move this texture slider too far to the right, it's going to grab too small of a detail, and some of the detail might be noise or something like that. It's not true detail for the scene, and it's going to upscale that, and it's going to look bad because you're upscaling noise and you're upscaling things that are, artifacts from the actual sensor of your camera that aren't really part of the scene. So that texture slider is important. You generally don't want to go too high with it, but you want to go just high enough where it's going to grab the actual parts that belong in the scene and upscale those properly. Generally, what I've found is general purpose works best for just about every image. Now, you may think that high detail would work best for this image because we have the fine feather detail of the blue jay, and you could see it moved the texture slider from 3 to 4 and the threshold slider up to 100. The threshold slider is kind of like, think of it as a reverse mask. If it's at 0, you're basically masking everything, and it's not going to allow the texture slider to do its thing. As you move it to the right, you're unmasking more and more of that finer detail so the texture slider could do its thing. So high detail, as you can see, it has texture at 4. By the way, this ranges from 1 to 6. So the preset for high detail has texture at 4 and threshold at 100. So it's going to affect everything in the image. Generally speaking, especially if you're making a very large upscale like I am here, I found that that doesn't work as well. So what I would prefer on this image is to use general purpose. And you can see textures at 3 and thresholds only at 25. And that really will work fine. Now you could experiment. Do one, and if it comes back when you're done with it, when we're done with this module, we'll return to the Browse module. Look at it in the Browse module. If it looks like it's pixelated, it has artifacts, or there's any mosaic pattern, you're going to have to come back in here with the original RAW file again, do a new file, a new PSD file from the original RAW file, and come back in here and try something different. Bring it down if it needs to be down, or if it's not sharp enough, bring everything up a little bit, and then maybe try this other preset of high detail. Landscapes, I've used, and actually I've not seen a difference between general purpose and landscape myself. I haven't seen a lot of difference. So I'll go with general purpose on this image. The smoothness slider helps get rid of some of that, those artifacts. So if your texture is a little too high, your threshold's a little too high, and you're upscaling some artifacts, the smoothness slider helps smooth those over as you move it to the right. So maybe you'll do this, bring it back into the Browse module and look at it at 1:1 and see that there's some artifacts. Maybe come back in here, use the same settings, except move the smoothness slider to the right and see if it helps. So that's settings. Next is sharpening. Generally, if you're printing to paper, you want to over sharpen the image just a little bit because the paper will absorb the ink and it tends to soften the image. So you want a little bit of over sharpening. There's 3 different types of sharpening available. They're all the same type of sharpening that's in Photoshop: progressive, unsharp mask, and high pass. I recommend that you use progressive. It seems to work the best for just about every image situation I've run across, and it's the easiest to understand. Progressive means the smallest, more minute detail it will sharpen more, and as it moves through medium detail and large detail, it sharpens less. That's why they call it progressive. So as you go from large detail to small detail, it progressively sharpens more. And it seems to do a great job for just about every scene that I've encountered. The default or the preset will set these, and I usually just leave them alone, or sometimes because I sharpen this already in the develop module, it may be a little bit too sharpened. So I'll bring this down. So in this case, I'm going to bring it down to around 10. So that will, I think, work out well. You could protect the highlights or shadows. Those are masks. So a lot of times you'll have noise in the shadows. That's inherent in most cameras. So you sharpen that and you'll make the noise look more prominent, more obvious. So what you could do is move the shadow slider to the right, and you'll not sharpen anything in the shadows. Conversely, sometimes you'll get noise in the highlights, especially if you have an expansive blue sky. You'll get noise up in that sky. If you add sharpening to it, you make it look worse. Move this slider to the right, and it will help smooth over and not get that noise up there in that sky. So that's the sharpening tab. Now, film grain, there's one of three reasons why you're going to add grain to your image. One is just a creative reason. You just want to add this grain look to it. Typically, I do that in the effects module or something like that, and I wouldn't do it here. The other two reasons, though, are more practical. The first is if you're printing a monochrome image, a black and white image. A lot of printers can't handle or can't truly represent the tonal range of grays. So when you print it, it just doesn't pop. It lacks depth. If you add a little grain to it, though, it will make it pop and give it some more depth, the illusion of depth. So if you print an image in black and white and it just doesn't seem to be popping, doesn't have any really depth to it, add a little grain and that may help. The other reason is if you're printing a large print and you have, especially in the case, let's say, of a large blue sky, printers can't handle printing large blue splotches across paper evenly. You'll get kind of a mosaic pattern often. If you add a little grain to it, it will give it just enough tooth for something that is something that the printer will recognize, and it will print the blue sky much more even. So if you do a print and your sky looks mosaic-y, hope you know what that means, kind of like blocky, then add a little film grain to it, and do it by just clicking it on and then moving the slider to add or remove the grain, the amount of grain. So that's film grain. Now the next two are kind of specialty tabs or panels. First is tiling, and we did talk about this when we talked about exporting an image before. If you need to print something and you're either going to use it to print a diptych or a triptych, or if you're printing it to a size that is bigger than your printer can handle, you're going to need to print out tiles. And these are individual prints. Your big print is broke down into smaller individual prints. So I'll turn that on, and you can see that it's defaulted to 8" by 10", and that is usually the paper you're using. So let's say we're using 8" by 10" paper. It's going to print out all these, looks like 8 different prints or outputs from the printer, and then you could assemble them afterwards. And when it prints it, it actually won't send it to the printer. It's going to send it to a JPEG file. So we're going to have 8 separate JPEGs, and you're going to choose where you want to save these at on your computer. Then you would take those and print those JPEGs. When it saves the files, it saves them by row and column. So if we're saving JPEGs, you have the choice, by the way, a JPEG or TIFF. So let's say we're saving JPEG. The first one would be row 1, column 1. This one would be row 1, column 2, row 1, column 3, and that's how they're labeled, so you could easily reassemble them afterwards. You could do an overlap, which, let's say a 0.25 inch overlap, which would help you, if you're taping them together, help you overlap them so they, easier to tape together. Something like that. So that's tiling, and we did cover that before. Now, gallery wrap is, if you're printing to canvas, that will go on a frame. That's usually a wooden frame, and usually the frames are like 1.5 inches thick. You could change that though here. So if you're printing to this gallery wrap, you'll see as soon as I turn that on, now it looks like it might have cropped away some pixels if you look on the inside, but really it isn't. That's our entire image inside of there. It just is going to add on these wings. That's the part of the canvas that will get folded over our wrap or frame. So that gets folded over the frame. And there's a few different methods that you could use. This is called a reflect mode. So you could see it's taking 2 inches on this side and reflecting it 180 degrees out. And that is kind of a neat effect you could have when you fold that over the frame. And typically if your frame is 1.5 inches, you'd want a thickness of 2. Make sure that it really fits over the frame. The other choices you have are reflect soft, and that will just blur it a little bit. The other one is stretch, where it won't do that 180 degree reflection, but it will just kind of stretch out. It will take these 2 inches, repeat it, and stretch it out. And then the last one is stretch soft. So it's just going to give it a little blur, if it ever does it. Computer's a little slow, so it blurs it a little bit. If you have something recognizable in the corners, you may want to blur it. So you want to either use stretch soft or reflect soft just to blur it a little bit. The last thing you could do with a gallery wrap is you could actually shade these, the part you fold over, with a specific color. So you could click here to pick your color. We're in monochromes. You can pick any color you want though. But we're going to use black, all right? And then what you do is you just move the opacity slider to the right. If I move it all the way to the right, we'll get a totally black overwrap or wrap. If we move it somewhere towards the middle, we'll get more of a gray, and you'll see some of the image below that. So you could kind of shade those so it's not as noticeable, or maybe handsomely affects the entire gallery wrap that you're doing. So that's gallery wrap, when we did cover that in a previous video, but I thought I'd do it here. But I'm not going to print this to canvas, and I'm not going to print it to a super large tiling type thing. I'm printing it 9,000 by 6,000 because I want to print this huge 20 by 30 inch print. And I'm pretty satisfied with my settings and my sharpening. Those are the two main things. So when I'm done, I'll go down here in the lower right hand corner and click done. Now this will take a while. It's going to actually create this humongous PSD file that's 309.07 megabytes in size. So it's going to take a while. So I'm going to pause the video. When we come back, you'll see we'll be in the browse module, but it will be on the original image. It won't be on this image. Okay, it finished its operation and it returned us to the browse module, and as you can see, we're on the original image. So I'm going to hit the G for the G key to go to grid view, and you can see there's our original RAW file, and right next to it is our PSD file that has been cropped. So I'm going to double click on that, and it's a humongous file. And you could remember that when we upscaled this, we upscaled it 231%. Now, a couple recommendations. I mentioned before that I wouldn't go over 300%. As a matter of fact, if possible, I wouldn't go 231% either. I try to keep it around 200 if possible. Also, don't go too crazy with the sharpening if you're printing a super large print. It's kind of counterintuitive. If you're printing a very small print, a 4x6, a wallet, you want a lot of sharpening. If you're printing a super large print, a 20 inch by 30 inch print, you generally don't need it to be super sharp. And particularly if you're upscaling an image as much as I upscaled this one, you don't want to overly sharpen it because it won't look right. I mentioned it's counterintuitive, but if you think it through, you'd understand. Typically, if you have, let's say, a 4x6 or something, you're holding it in your hand looking at it and you're a foot away from it. But a big 20x30, you're standing further back, and that sharpening isn't needed, and it really won't look right. It will look better not being super sharp. Looking at this image, I think it's a little bit over sharp. When it's printed, I did mention that the print will soak in some of the ink and it will soften the image a little bit. Whether or not it actually does, how much it does, I don't know until I actually print it. Every paper will vary, even the type of printer you use and the ink used will vary. So it's difficult to say, particularly if I'm sending it off to a lab. If I was printing it this myself, I could print one, see what it looks like. If it looks too sharp, I could go back in and reduce sharpening and then print it again. So that's it for what I consider to be the most underrated module in On1 Photo RAW 2018, the Resize Module. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.